Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank the C3 organization, the Executive Council, for inviting us to be part of this conversation today. It's been really refreshing for me to engage with students and faculty and staff who are committed to diversity and who are committed to looking at how race influences the academic experiences of our minority youth. And so I look forward to chatting to you for the next hour and getting some ideas from you on the topic. Thank you.
Hi. Yes, so thank you, by the way, for a beautiful introduction. We appreciate you. And also thank you to everyone who organized this fantastic event. When we got the email to come and participate, we were particularly honored because this is an effort that signals a kind of readiness that is really important in higher education, this entire C3 enterprise and all that goes along with it. So, we thought we might first start by acknowledging, thank you for being here instead of at the March for Science. I imagine you'd have liked to have been at both. We would have liked to have been at both.
Solidarity.
Okay, so we thought we would, and by the way, forgive me, I'm one of these people who refers a little bit to my notes, and I don't have the screen with the notes, so I'm gonna fuss with this paper a little bit. Please forgive that. I don't use it much, but enough that work with me if you will. Okay, so we thought we'd begin by explaining a little bit about the title we chose. And if you notice, it's slightly different here than it is in the program. This has happened to me before. We write cheeky titles and people assume that's gotta be a typo. Who would put a little more in a title? And so it got shifted for the program, but in fact, it's quite intentionally being a little more intentional in our leadership for social justice. And you'll see why that is in just a moment. Recent events have startled the nation out of its false sense of colorblindness and its exaggerated sense of progress on issues of racial and other kinds of diversity. I think that's a fair thing to say, especially as references to student fragility and snowflakeness, and what's the third example? Out of control political correctness, sort of are soft ways of masking actually quite a dark impulse in the public discourse around higher ed and beyond that. And so in this address, we want to start a conversation, or really continue a conversation about why, in fact, even in these sort of dark times, we actually think that college campuses have an opportunity, we all have an opportunity to be hopeful and to, sort of take on greater resolve around issues of equity and diversity in higher ed as a bellwether for the larger changes that we need in our society. College campuses have for a long time been bellwethers for social change, roughly through their entire existence, though I would argue that from an institutional perspective, that's been more accidental than we like to admit, right? That's been a little bit more lucky than we care to admit, especially, mostly if you don't mind the phrase, the grown-ups on campus. And it has happened at some institutional levels more than at others, more than we care to admit, right? Because we wear this bellwether mantle fairly proudly, but I think it's worth pulling it apart a little bit, and that there's utility in doing so. And I believe that by your presence here, you believe that there's more to do despite our bellwether sort of leadership for change. We can talk a little bit about this idea of bellwether. Right? Here's a basic definition, like dictionary.com, an indicator or predictor of something. That I assume you mostly knew. Let's focus a little bit on the second. Oh, and I also love that college campuses are so much bellwethers that we're part of the dictionary.com definition of what it means to be a bellwether, right? But let's look at that second part a little bit. Not everybody quite knows the origin of this word, and I think word origins can be really sort of powerfully instructive for us at times. So the leading sheep of a flock, which wears a bell on its neck. People knew that? Yes? All right. Well, actually, a bellwether is a castrated ram, to be exact. Yeah. I mean, more interestingly, that leader of the flock, we can wonder how it comes to be the leader of the flock. right? What is it about that particular sheep, ram, that makes it become the leader? Does the farmer have a good eye for picking out the natural leader, the one that's going to lead them to the best grass and not into the road in front of buses and so forth, like all the videos on YouTube? How does the farmer know? And the truth is, in fact, sorry, shepherd, they don't know. They just pick one, right? The bellwether gets the bell hung around its neck, and unless it's something about the castration, I think it's the bell that causes them to be the leader of the flock, right? Just the wearing of the block. All right, oh, there's the wether as a castrated ram. And so, if you look at this guy, it's hard for me to get close enough to point, but there is one wearing a bell. Can you see it there on the left? First of all, he's only sort of at the front, and he's probably being pushed as much as he's leading. Right? Now you might think this undermines the common usage of the word bellwether, but actually I think this is partly how I want to characterize us as campuses. We're at the front. We didn't entirely volunteer to be there. Sometimes we're pushing backwards, hoping not to get pushed forward much, right? But I don't want to take all our credit away. Eventually we lumber forward and we do help enact important changes, right? And so even though this guy may be reluctant, at the end of the day, he's got the bell, and they're going where he goes, for whatever reason that might be, okay? So there's that. But I want to disavow of any notions that we're this bellwether, right? We're not this, but I assume that it maybe if you have kids, or if, I assume almost every campus on the entire continent showed this movie in some community gathering night to start conversations about diversity. People know this villain. This is Bellwether, the villain of this, who is a bellwether. She sees trends coming, if only by evil genius creating them, right? But I'm saying we're not that, right? We're more like the guy who's sort of reluctantly at the front, you know, sometimes going forward, etc. Okay, so that's one reason we wanted to evoke the image or the idea of bellwether, because we'd argue that mostly we're like this poor fellow who is not exactly full steam ahead. And if you extend that metaphor just a little bit further, you can see how we come to get the bell. Right? Our students are actually, I would argue, mostly the drivers of our leadership for diversity in higher education, right? Because for a number of reasons, but when you, I'm speaking to the students, when you call us to be honest to our principles, to do the things that we say we will do, right? We all have these beautiful mission statements and these other kinds of beautiful statements about equity and equality that don't always meet the road. And so when you all call us out on that, because we care about you, right? Because, and I would argue this may be a difference between us and, say, corporations and governments anymore, we care about you. And so if the kids are not all right, at some point we will respond. You might have to say it a lot for a long time and pretty loudly. You might have to embarrass us in the press occasionally. But eventually we actually do believe that we have a job of serving you. And so I think it's important to note that even in the cases where it's not as obvious, students are largely the drivers of our leadership for diversity and inclusion and other things in higher education. By the way, we tried to pick images from the C3 colleges. Anybody see themselves in these pictures? We don't have money for you or anything. I just wanted to know if you... Okay. So there's another sense in which we wanted to evoke the idea of bellwether, which comes from a 1996 novel by Connie Willis. So in the novel, the main protagonist is a scientist, and she studies trends and how trends start, etc. And she works for a company that wants this information, figuring if we can figure out how trends start, then we can start trends and make a lot of money by knowing ahead of time what people are going to do or buy, etc. So her job is to, with other scientists, figure out trends. Along the way, they decide to study sheep. What makes a bellwether? Maybe that will give us some idea of how this happens in human populations. They don't know the part about the random putting of the bell, apparently. And so after much study, they come to the conclusion that bellwethers are only a little greedier, a little faster, a little hungrier, and thereby a little ahead of the flock, right? I would argue this is also a decent characterization of the role of higher ed in leading change, right? That little bit in this case is our little bit more responsiveness to our constituencies that allows us, that leads us to take seriously the need for change. Okay, so that's one of the really main points that we wanted to make or start the whole thing off with, which is that, uh-oh, see, I told you I'd be fumbling with papers a little bit. That higher education, as higher education leaders, we are generally at the leading bellwether edge of a lot of social justice activities, but I wouldn't want us to allow ourselves the special amnesia of self-congratulations about it, right? We love to wear that mantle, we love to claim it, and it's okay to claim it, but we need to remember how we get here, and how we get here is so often through student action, and how we get here is so often painful and uncomfortable and hard. Right? Because if we have a false amnesia that allows us to think it was easy back in the day, then the work that's ahead of us may seem almost insurmountable, and we do have quite a lot of work ahead of us. And so it's important to remember how hard and gritty it is to actually get these things done. Yes, but that we can by being, a little bit more responsive in the ways that we have. All right, so yeah, I just wanted to make a reference to what some of the things Adrian said last night about, we want to be responsive, but we still have to contend with traditions. We still have to contend with self-governance and all these factors that create inertia for another kind of emotion. All right, so next we want to talk a little bit about diversity in higher ed, but to do that, it's sort of worth talking just for a moment about higher ed more broadly, the history of higher ed, if you will. So we can think about, Wikipedia tells me, let's do it this way, bear with me, Wikipedia we chose on purpose, that modern higher ed was invented in Italy with a school at Bologna, was followed thereafter, this will be a very abbreviated history, with Oxford in England, followed by Cambridge in England, etc., right? So you have these venerated institutions of higher ed that are the beginning of higher education in the world, right? And that's lovely. And then things progressed into the United States with places like Harvard and Yale, which were then followed by places like Williams and Middlebury, etc. And you can see the DNA is rather continuous, right, with those early iterations, Oxford, etc. Right? Even in our descriptions, I don't know if those are legible, but those are descriptions from the origin stories of some of your own websites and ours, right? And they actually mention Oxford, they mention Yale as the seed, the DNA for who they are and how they do what they do, right? And that's important to note. Now, that's a lovely origin story. It's our higher education history, right? And the rest is history, right? So I want to problematize that notion as well, right? I think it's important to realize that you can create this history if you're really careful in how you define higher education, and that's what we tend to do. But in fact, and this will only be a momentary thing, higher ed goes way further back if you have a sort of open definition of it, right? So we have, as far back in Iran, Pakistan, China, many things predating higher ed as it evolved in its form currently, the models that we use, right? And that's significant because the other version of the origin story creates ownership myths, right? If we own higher education because we created, I'm not in that we, by the way, because we created it and it serves us pretty well, then the other half of that sentence is anybody who's struggling must be unfit, right? Anybody who comes here and doesn't like it has no right to try and change our higher education. They need to come on in and fit in or else step off, right? You see the ownership narratives, how they can become problematizing. Right? When we have the inertia of dressing like a medieval monk all these years later, right, the traditions that we have, and when we see them as part of the origin story of this thing that we own, it makes this otherizing possible in a way that will hinder efforts to adjust the institutions themselves. You with me so far? Okay. Yes. And then that enables, well, actually this is sorry.
Thank you. And one of the key challenges that we have to propose to ourselves in thinking about this idea of diversity is what are the profiles that we deem important for the students to kind of present themselves at our institutions. We really have to question, what are the criteria or the characteristics that we think are important traits for helping our students succeed. And when we hold these narratives of ownership, when we hold these Eurocentric narratives of what it means to be a successful student, what it means to be a successful citizen of this institution, we really allow people to say things like diversifying programs on campus reduces the quality of students that we bring onto campus. We often hear conversations like that illuminating the idea that as we expand our student population, the quality of student that we bring onto campus is really not on par with what we are used to. Where's the clicker? And so as an example, I want to share with you an exchange that happened on Facebook with someone. I blocked out their names. But this is someone, we had an incident at one of our 5Cs where the RAs are really not happy with how the institution is dealing with issues of diversity, supporting students in their financial quests. And one person stated, "Note to all applicants, choose your college carefully. If you don't feel it offers what you need from all perspectives, then don't apply. Do your research carefully before you accept an offer. Don't assume you can reverse the culture of an institution. You may influence it perhaps, but don't think you can turn it into something it does not want to become. If you do become an activist, think carefully about how your words and actions might alienate those whom you would want to be wiser to cultivate as supporters." And this is something that someone expressed to me just last week in trying to say, if you don't fit the profile of who we think should be at this institution, then don't come. Don't try to engage us in conversations. And this is one of the ideas that we want to push forward, in that in thinking of what are we communicating to our students in terms of whether they have the ability to strive forward and help drive change, right?
Raise your hand if you've heard or witnessed a comment of this type at your or some other campus, right? So that is premised on ownership mythologies, right? And I know somebody out here is thinking, well, the truth of the matter is, at least in its current form, like, we are sort of very indebted to the Platonic models, and the European model has, that kind of staying power, and those other models aren't present so much, so maybe it's not so bad to make it. But you know what? That's kind of, to me, is a bit like bragging about centuries of oppression, violence, and suppression, right? There's a reason those are the models that have persisted, right? Now, that's a bit dark, and I don't want to go down a very dark road, but I'm saying that to say, let's just agree that you didn't invent higher education, you don't own it, neither do I. We're all here, and we should all partake in this public good. Is that a fair compromise there? Okay. Yes. So, I think it's going to be you again, right?
Yeah. Yeah, we're playing.
So coming back to the main thread, the real reason of this history was to also highlight the amazing continuity of these places and the amazing similarity among them and across time. Oh, okay. Sorry, this is our first time trying to pass it back and forth like this. Hope you'll bear with us. I hope the message is worthwhile. Anyway, so yes, if we look carefully at global higher ed, in fact, we've stayed fairly doggedly true to the original sort of establishing principles about how the institutions should function on a day-to-day, week-to-week, annual basis, even in the types of buildings that we like to build, the way they are structured architecturally to manage people flow, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we can talk about diversity in higher education and what that means for questions of diversity in higher education, right? So how we define diversity varies depending on the context, and can be construed to include all sorts of things, right? In fact, it's probably easier to say what you wouldn't include. So a place is non-diverse if it includes primarily white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, middle class or higher, heterosexual, able-bodied, and depending on the field of study, men, right? That would be a non-diverse campus. Even though, strictly speaking, all kinds of diversity are possible within those parameters, right? You could do something like thinness and height. You could do all kinds of things. You could do political orientation, right? Now those things may be aside from the sort of core and for some reason secret mission of many diversity efforts, which is to redress sort of current and past inequality, right? But one of the things we do is we use this gentle language in order to do something, and it can potentially cause problems for us down the road. So the definitional flexibility betrays the fact that the very term, basically, as we employ it in higher education, is more politically than sociologically accurate, right? Still legitimate and important, but importantly political. And this is an important issue because, well, this is what I started to say, that it's often a side. Like, so I would argue, I would assume that many of the people in this room understand efforts toward diversity as part of a larger project of addressing past and current factors that create less unequal access to higher education. Hands if that's sort of your orientation to this. Almost none. Oh, interesting, all right. So I was pleased actually to see President Falk reference it this way last night, and some of the other speakers have done it that way too, right? But even if you do agree that there is this social justice component, that it does importantly attempt to address inequality, structural and otherwise, not just by accident, but the ones that are wrapped up in issues of power, there are still going to be people on your campuses who are either unaware or unconcerned with that kind of issue, or who might believe and say that it's unproductive to think about it in those terms, right? And so these are the people that you have to keep at the table by talking about the benefits to the whole student body of diversity. And that's true, but it's aside from some of the other questions, right? These are the people that you have to talk about the economic value of having more perspectives on campus, because international students usually pay full tuition and they won't come if your school's not a little bit diverse, for example, right? So there are all these sort of market-based kinds of selling things, and I actually remember when the language started to shift. I was in graduate school and it felt a little icky, even though it seemed like it might work, and I was sure that there was another shoe to fall, and so it has come to pass. And we've all been in that meeting where someone says, well, what about, political orientation, right? Which is, it is a form of diversity. I'm not going to deny that. But it is not wrapped up in the same historical and current power differentials that actually drive many of our diversity efforts, right? And so there are things, possible costs, that are involved with what it takes to keep people with power who are benefiting at the hands of the social order at the table. Because you can't send them away, then you don't get money. For example, right? But I've also, at my school right now, there's a group of scholars who are upset that their courses were denied cross-listing with Africana Studies, even though those courses, the department looks at the syllabus, looks at the readings, etc., and determined that those courses take a very old school colonialist attitude toward things going on in Africa, not ironically. And so we rejected them for cross-listing, and we're told we were not being diverse. We were not supporting diversity. Do you understand? So this is the other side of that, let's be, pleasant shoe, and it's worth acknowledging that as well. And I'm not saying we shouldn't use the gentler language that keeps people at the table, but it's been coming and it's arrived, the other shoe that falls, when our definition is then twisted for purposes that we hadn't really had in mind. Okay. Yes.
So one of the key ideas that we try to also discuss in our scholarship is what are some of the benefits associated with engaging in higher education. And there's an extensive line of research looking at the economic benefits, higher pay, greater job stability, but there are also other benefits including the less tangible psychological advances, higher self-esteem. And so when you're looking at the literature, we think of higher education as really serving a dual function. On the one end, higher education and participating in higher education kind of provides the opportunity for social mobility. It provides students with access to social capital and cultural capital that they may not have access to without participating in higher ed. However, there's the other flip side of the coin where higher education also serves as a stratifying function, right? And so we see ultimately how 2-year and 4 institutions often work towards stratifying our student population, locating more of our minority and underrepresented students at institutions that may not be ranked as high, or a high proportion of minority students located at two-year institutions. And so we constantly have to negotiate and navigate this tension in higher education, serving a function in helping us transcend our social strata, but then also serving as a way to maintain the existing social hierarchies that we are aware of in our society. And so one of the questions and one of the issues we often hear when dealing with issues related to diversity is administrators or even sometimes faculty saying, and this is happening at the 5 colleges right now, that bringing a diverse student population on campus reduces the quality of the student. And so we looked at a little bit of research, and Bowen's research actually shows that that's not the case. In reviewing the data of 19 elite institutions here in the US, they found that when the admission policies support minority students or a diverse student population, if those students receive the support they need once they are at those institutions, they really perform on par with the general student population. So we really have to arm ourselves with the data and the knowledge of understanding that this myth that once you expand your student diversity, you reduce the quality, we should use that to actually counter some of these narratives that undermine our progress to advancing and expanding our student population, right?
I'm gonna stay here.
Okay,
you're gonna be, yeah.
Okay.
So we can talk then about sort of what the trends are, right? So access has become one of the things that we've gotten much better at. We're far from done, but we've got better access than we did. Going all the way back to 1969 with the introduction of the Higher Education Act and other public policy shifts, but also homegrown sort of social justice initiatives on campuses have actually created a significant shift in who is actually on campus. And that's fantastic. It's partly tied to population shifts, right? It's actually no longer practical to only admit, you know, sort of white hetero kids, because that's not who's all applying anymore, but also because of, like I said, homegrown attempts. Real, you know, this is the work we've been talking about a lot this weekend, where many of us have had a significant headway in actually diversifying our student bodies, and that's very important because higher ed is becoming more broadly and equitably available, but then other questions arrive once you've accomplished that, and I'll pass it back to you, Shalva. Shall I click to the...
So the big question is, what is diversity? How do we measure diversity? How do we measure our success towards diversity? What do we use as criteria for assessing whether we support our students or not? And one of the key concepts that we've kind of been exposed to in our research is this idea of critical diversity. So using a critical lens to really understand the issues that lead to the power dynamics that lead to the manifestation of students not feeling welcome, not feeling accepted on the student campus. And we can use ethnic diversity in the US as kind of a case in point, right? So we've had an expansion in the diversity demographic of students on campus. We have more minority students, we have more women at institutions of higher education. But we do see trends in these students actually graduating at a lower rate. We see that they experience more challenges when they're enrolled at institutions. So for a few minutes, I looked at the iPads data for your institutions to see how everyone is doing. And what you can see is that the common thread here is that the majority of the students at all of your institutions are still white. So in some instances, it's 71%. In other instances, it's about 44%. One of the interesting things I noticed is that UC Berkeley has more Asian students than white students on campus. But what we note also on the bottom is that the minority students are really concentrated together. There are similar numbers of representation for African American students and also Latino students, and also almost virtually no Native American students. So what we see is that there's a continuation of this trend in the representation in terms of ethnic diversity on our campuses for the C3 consortium, right? And so we have to think about what are some of the factors that lead to some institutions being a little bit more successful than others. What are some of the targets we want to set for ourselves in improving, and also just sharing the knowledge so our students can know exactly how our institutions are doing in their diversity efforts. So you can go.
Critical diversities.
So the key concept here is this idea of critical diversity. We have two kind of ideas that we've noticed in looking and comparing diversity trends globally. One of them being that there are some common themes or common threads in terms of diversity efforts in higher education. So when we look at gender, most institutions globally have worked really hard at advancing the academic attainment of women. You can see that in the US context. You can also see that in other contexts like Brazil, New Zealand. When you're comparing higher education transformation, women have more access to higher education. However, there are also unique themes that emerge in the development of diversity efforts. So the local context really has a big influence on kind of what becomes the salient identities that we use to define and mark our progress towards diversity. So in my home context in South Africa, we speak 11 official languages, right? 85% of the population speaks an African language. However, none of the 23 higher ed institutions in South Africa use an African language as their mode of instruction. So what you notice, which is unique in this context, is language becomes a filter for deciding who makes that transition from the K through 12 system to the higher education system. So we may have more women in higher education, we may have more women enrolled in postgraduate study. However, if you're a black female from a rural area who speaks maybe the African language of Xhosa, you're not very likely to make that transition, because within the local context, this very unique issue of language and language acquisition filters out which students will make the transition from the K through 12 system to the higher ed system. So go.
Yes. So yeah, there are different local ones, but then there are also sort of common themes, right? So gender is one, race is one. And so next we thought we'd present you with something of a case in point. So we're at the point now where we've got the students. Many of them are here. We need more, but many of them are here. There's a certain level of critical mass. And by critical mass, one of the things I want to talk about is that there are enough of them that they don't feel like they need to shut up anymore. Right? This is actually one of my favorite things about the Posse program, because thanks to the 40 Posse students on campus, plus the variety of other sort of cohort programs, et cetera, now they have enough critical mass that when they realize something's not happening right for them, they can look around at enough people and go, yeah, this is messed up. Let's go talk to somebody, right? So we've got them. We've got to deal with them, right? And getting them there is one thing, and in fact, a lot of schools have invested quite a large number of resources in helping them adjust, helping them settle in, helping them feel welcome, right? But I'm going to try and problematize that notion for you a little bit. So we've got an Office of Black Student Affairs or some such thing, and we've got a Queer Resource Center, and we've got sort of various sort of support centers. But if you think about it, those centers are largely, and we've got mentors, sometimes we have special mentoring sessions to help the students keep up academically, and we've got special counseling, but mostly those kinds of efforts are geared toward helping the students fit into how we do, right? As if how we do, what we do, how we structure things is immutably correct, as evidenced by our 1,000-year track record. Right? So now we're back onto the ownership myths, right? So we need to problematize that, and we can do it by evoking one particular thing, which is the idea of culture. And it's one in a sea of variables that you could look at. It's a nice one, though, I think, because particular to sort of students of color that are arriving on our campus, there are systematic differences in what they're bringing to the table culturally. This is related to my work that I have done in K-12. I was almost a little surprised at how well it has mapped onto the higher education scape, right? And I'm going to show you some data about that. But to do that, we have to sort of define culture very briefly. All right, so functional culture. Culture gets used a lot, so I don't mean the culture of the internet, and I don't mean like the corporate culture. That's culture in one sense, but in psychology, we're increasingly more interested in what we can call fundamental culture or deep structure culture. And I'm not going to bore you with a big, long definition, but you can think of it as group habits of thought, right? And here's a quote from Whoa, did I lose? Yes, I did. What happened? There we go. Quote from Edmund Gordon and Eleanor Armour Thomas, who said that although people can be physiologically capable, right, we're not different biologically in this, but to the extent that we move together in cultural communities, we can tend to adopt certain shared modes of perception, thinking, and behavior. Right? There's now neuroscience data suggesting that this becomes reified in the patterns of our thinking. Right? So I don't mean like casually because you chose to today think that way, but in a more serious sense at the deeper cognitive level group habits of thought. Okay. Now, group habits of thought would influence how you might answer this question, right? Or this question. What's the basic relationship of people with other people, and what should people strive toward? Right? So you could answer this, for example. Obviously, you're here to get yours. The individual is an end in and of him or herself and ought to actualize, self-actualize, maybe despite pressure to not do that. I'm here to be my main self. That is certainly an element of sort of the mainstream culture of the United States, right? One has to do for self, right? Has to seek independence, has to decentrate from family, community, etc. But some people could answer something else quite different. Right? You could answer people are fundamentally interdependent and ought to prioritize the relationship views and needs and goals of the group. And so the argument I'm making is that quite a number of our students of color who arrive on our campuses may be caught up in the distinction between these two perspectives. Right? Because if it's true that our colleges are still reinventing and there's a word I want, reaffirming the cultural orientations of the seed culture, right, which is going to be Europe, but also maintained in sort of the hundreds of years in this country, then our institutions are probably reflecting some cultural values. You don't want to talk about a college as having a culture in this sense per se, but all the people who work and keep it going are part of maintaining individualistic narratives and structures in the way that things are done. Right? This is where that tradition stuff becomes particularly potentially dangerous, right? And now you have these kids who are coming in with a decidedly different orientation. And so we can talk about how their culture intersects and interacts with the culture of the institutions that are meaning to serve them. And again, because the way we do things is not unassailably and immutably correct, but we act that way. Right, so we want to help the kids understand how to interact with our institutions, but we don't spend as much time thinking about, well, if this is who our students are, maybe we ought to be doing something different. What we end up doing is going, these students are not like the students we're used to. How do we fix them? Right, and I would argue that that is inherently problematic in the way that we, even when we're spending millions and billions of dollars to help with diversity, it's problematic because it misconstrues the problem, right? And it misconstrues the problem, again, out of these ownership myths, out of this, sort of investment in tradition, continuity, etc. When in almost every other industry, guess what? If you're not serving your clients, you either go out of business or change what you're doing. And I would argue that this is what higher ed needs to do a better job of, seeing who the students are and figuring out what they need. So here's a case in point. And this is actually the chapter, the same chapter that was referenced in the intro. So it's strange for me that I can't walk over there. I'll fall off the stage. So this is the model that we offered in that chapter. Maybe I can. And basically, it's attempting to sort of understand the constellation of relationships among some important variables that students deal with in higher education, right? So at the end, the gold star is academic success. That's what we want. That's what we want for our students. And so what we're arguing is that for most of our sort of traditional students who come in with an independent, that says interdependent, but if you come in with an independent self-construal, a belief that you are, an entity in and of yourself, that's going to dovetail nicely with everything that happens to you when you come on campus. Right? They're going to expect you to be independent. They're going to support you in certain kinds of ways, but their expectations for how you're going to solve a problem with your financial aid are right in line with how you're going to try and solve your problems with financial aid. Their expectations with how you're going to seek help academically are in line with your expectations of how you're going to seek academically. And so all of everything flows along nicely. If you have students who come in with just one decidedly different orientation, a lot of those relationships break down. A lot of those interactions are not scaffolded appropriately. So where you have someone with an interdependent self-construal, first of all, to the extent that all the classroom activities are organized around either competition or individualism, that's going to have a negative relationship with academic success right there, even if you can adjust. And by getting admitted to a fancy school such as the ones represented in this room, many of our students will be able to adjust, but there's a cost, right? If they had strengths and abilities that you could have capitalized on toward their academic success and you ignored those, therefore they had to make an adjustment, that's a cost to them, right? And that cost may play out in some other ways, such as to their well-being, right? So I didn't say, but having that self-construal would probably lead to you a preference for learning in groups. Right? And to the extent that's not part of the structure, a group learning orientation will be negatively associated with performance. And then here's the thing, right? Because we're really talking about, well, we talk about race, but one of the things that we argue is that, in fact, sometimes we're talking about culture and cultural differences that are creating tensions that then become racialized when all the kids who look the same are having the same problem. Right? And the institution is like, I don't understand, we love them, we want them to thrive, but then when you're ignoring who they are, it seems like you just don't like them. Right? And when you're ignoring who they are, it's about ignoring what they bring to the table in terms of orientations, pensions, skills, etc. Right? And then that becomes racialized. And so in the chapter we did, there's a study associated with it, and we basically checked these relationships and affirmed that, in fact, people with a higher interdependent self-construal tend to be more interested in who members of their group are. What that means is that when there's a racial incident on campus, I take that personally, right? It's not like that just happened to Jamal. No, that happened to Jamal, and he's like me, he's one of us, so that happened to me. That's gonna have a deeper impact on me than it might for someone who doesn't feel that way. And so we found positive relationships between feeling connected to your group, but also with then feeling like you experienced discrimination. Even if it didn't happen to you personally. I teach a course. Every single semester, at least one day, I have to put the syllabus aside and talk about whatever happened on campus or nationally around race. So this is a real phenomenon. I think you could say the same, yes? And then similarly, what this sort of cascades into is mistrust for the institution in a way that's racialized, even though at the core of it may be something that's a little bit more cultural. And the nice thing about that is that you can respond to a cultural thing, right? You don't, because if you're just saying, but I'm not a racist, right? The college is not racist, and you're not, I believe you, right? But you might be being tone deaf to who the students are because you have a different expectation of what students are like. And so to the extent they're being tone deaf and it's systematically identifiable to certain students, it feels racial to them, and that's all that matters. Does that make sense to you? Okay. Now, since then, we've done some more research, and I'm not gonna go into detail because I think we wouldn't have time for that, but I will just say, another study with Hurley, Leith, Hurley, and Pauletto, we've actually checked this pathway now, that in fact, cooperative learning preferences are negatively associated with academic success, and then in fact the flip is true, where you create academic success possibilities that are capitalizing on collective orientations, they are positive with success. It's just that's not yet happening in our classrooms, and so right now it's still negative with success. In 3 studies actually with students at Pomona, we found that this is also true among certain Latino populations, right? So we found these same phenomena of collectivism or communalism having, if you capitalize it toward the benefit, if you make achievement contingent on using those skills that you might come to the table with, people who are like that thrive academically, that's what I'm trying to say. So it's broader than just students of African heritage. And then finally, we've tested this other one in a study with Shauna Leith, who's gonna graduate from Michigan soon. Yay, Shauna, one of my students, I'm very proud of her. Also tested this relationship between discrimination experiences, in this case in the form of microaggression, and how it does in fact undermine people's academic success and perceptions of academic success as well. And so now we've actually got if we actually pulled it apart, some of it's on the indirect side, but basically we've got evidence that all the pathways in this model matter, and that this may be an important way to think about the way that you've got to engage with students who come from a variety of backgrounds on your campus. That it's about recognizing who they are and using that information to genuinely shift some of the structures and the ways, everydayness of doing things on campus. Yes.
And so one of the big questions that we try to address in our conversations is what can we do to really address some of these disparities in diversity in higher education? What are some of the practical steps that work for administrators, staff members in dealing with and addressing some of the challenges we face on campus? And I want to share with you maybe a few strategies that have been commonly used. The first one, and this is proposed by a scholar, Jansen, who does work on higher ed transformation in the comparative sense. Jansen suggests that, first of all, we need to look at physical desegregation. And a lot of our campuses have already engaged in efforts to really minimize the segregation on campus, to allow students to integrate and have multicultural spaces. But the second one is very important, and I think it's related to that comment. It has to do with social integration. And here Jansen proposes that simply putting a group of students together in the same space is not going to reduce incidents of discrimination, and it's not going to create the conditions where we could address some of the challenges we face in our interpersonal interactions with one another. So we have to create an environment that allows for meaningful interactions between the agents that are involved in these situations, right? So we have to create a culture that allows and reduces the power dynamics, and that allows people to work cooperatively towards a common goal. A third recommendation is this idea of knowledge transformation. And this really hinges on the idea that you cannot change a racially exclusive university without taking into account the knowledge that it's been based on, without taking into account the historical myths that inform how we share knowledge and what we value in our institutions. A next one I think ties in with some of the comments that our keynote speaker Adrian shared with us last night, which is this idea of cultural embrace. If you think about her comments on tradition, and we do things this way, we've always done it that way, cultural embrace really calls us to question the symbolic ways in which we signal to people that they are not welcome in this space. What did we name our buildings? What are our streets named on campus? What artwork do we have displayed? What social events do we offer our students on campus? It's really questioning the symbolic ways in which we signal to students that they belong and that we want them to succeed in that space. The next one relates to emotional inclusion, and it once again it has to do with really signaling to the students that they have a sense of belonging, but also acknowledging the multiple microaggressions that students, the cumulative effect of the multiple microaggressions they experience in engaging with faculty members, in engaging with financial aid, the psychological impact that may have on them. And then the final recommendation really has to do with leadership. One of the key suggestions being that when an institution makes an effort towards changing policy and practices on campus, this has to be done in a very public way. It's not okay to change your policies and have your diversity statement kind of on a shelf in your office. It's really important for leadership to do this in a very public way, as to signal to your students, to your staff and your faculty that this is a priority for the institution at large, and this is something that you want to focus on in terms of transformation. All right? So can you go to the next slide?
Sure.
And so we wanted to spend a few minutes and ask you to engage in a little bit of a conversation at your table regarding diversity and diversity efforts at your own institution. One of the scholars that looks at diversity efforts in terms of infusing the curriculum on campus with diversity says that perceptions of importance and quality of diversity efforts at the institutional level are really significant predictors of openness to diverse perspectives on campus. So what that research is suggesting is that your openness and your understanding of the importance of diversity and the quality of the diversity efforts on campus are really important in predicting whether people will engage in diversity efforts on campus. So we would like for you to spend a few minutes discussing at your table your progress or lack of diversity efforts on campus. So you may think about admissions, you may think about faculty recruitment or retentions. What are some of the ways in which your institutions have actually tried to address the diversity issues on campus? Can you go to the next slide? And these are the 6 categories. I maybe think each person will take a minute to share. If you have a very innovative way of dealing with diversity, share that with the table. If you think you're on the leading front of a specific diversity effort, there's also the category of best practices or progressive practices, where you flexibly employ evidence based on practice in higher ed, and the institution is open to changing their practices. There's also a proactive and protective category, where there's an awareness of the value in seeking action and being in line with national trends. There's a reactive category, which is really a compliance mindset. An inactive category where there's no meaningful coordinated efforts, or regressive efforts towards diversity, where you're really kind of working backwards and not making a lot of progress. So we thought maybe we'll share, say 5 minutes with you sharing at your table with the rest of the people if you have any examples of these categories.
And one of the things we'd like to see here happen here is that there could be an interesting contrast in the way that students and staff and faculty see the same issues on a campus. And so we're hoping that your conversations will sort of elucidate the differences that are potential across constituencies on a single campus on how you would rate any particular effort or need around diversity. So you have 5 to 7 minutes, maybe turn around and talk, and we're going to float a little bit, and then we'll probably do a quick report back at the end.
There's someone over here, Carrie, right there. Yeah. Thank you. Let's hear maybe, would you share your name and let the group know who you are and what you're sharing with us?
So my name is Brittany. I'm
Hi.
a grad student, and one of the things that I mentioned is at Berkeley we're under this.
Can we just listen to Brittany sharing an example with us? Thank you, Brittany.
At Berkeley we're going through a lot of budget crises, so a lot of departments are trying to sort of pinch pennies where they can. And one of the things that my department has started doing is that they've reserved money. They only allow students of color in when they're sure that they're going to win diversity fellowships. And they reserve department funding for essentially white students. And this is something that's come up. It came up when I was coming into the department. I was supposed to get this fellowship and then didn't, and then they said you can't come, and then they backtracked on that and they said, oh, actually we have money now. But even in successive years, I'm a third year, I've noticed that they only want students of color if they can essentially earn their keep. And this is something that they say, like, we don't want to do this, but because of budget reasons, we have to make sure that like we save money where we can, and essentially like students of color are budget students where they can save money.
And because of fairness, you won't get in the regular way.
Yeah, exactly. And you don't deserve to have sort of the regular funding because you're here to.
And would you say that is a regressive?
Yeah, I'm going to put that in the red.
Okay. All right. And so before Eric gives some concluding remarks, one of the things we would like you to think about is where there are mismatches between what students are saying is happening. You know, oftentimes as administrators, we have this very glorified perception of the efforts we're making, the strides we're making, and yet our students are saying something differently, like Brittany just shared with us now in her experience. So being aware of that mismatch is important.
Okay, well, Carrie says we have time to hear from one more person, and I'm willing to go on your authority, so let's do it.
Hello. Okay, hi. I just want to speak on one of the things that I'm particularly quite proud of Amherst College. I'm a student there that goes there, is that Amherst does not only do they do like 100% need-blind admissions for international and domestic students, they also have a huge, they work really hard to recruit students from community colleges also, and students that are veterans. And considerably seeing the fact that Amherst endowment, I know it's like significantly large, it's like 2.2 billion, but I know there's a lot of elite colleges here that have similar somewhat endowments, and I'm just trying to see why is it, in my opinion, that if Amherst is putting all this money on the line to recruit these students, because of their efforts of recruitment, our campus is at least like 44% people of color. Like if you go to the campus, you should see it left and right. There are a lot of students of color from a lot of different socioeconomic status. It's one of the things that I think a lot of these schools should put a lot of pressure on is to put in more money on the table that can help recruit and retain these students and be able to also recruit students that also need like this, to be given that second chances, like veterans, like community college students, partnering with like the Jan Can Cook or reaching out for like more with Crossbridge. I'm not entirely sure of the avenues on that, but that's one of the things I find really proud in Amherst, that I feel like a lot of other liberal art colleges or even elite colleges are falling a little behind on. And I know sometimes it's a little hard because I was talking about it earlier with my chief of diversity officers, is Amherst is like in this gray area, but I still think like that's one of the things that institutions should thrive to do and should thrive to seek out, because there's too many times I feel like institutions just need to just get out there and start like putting their money where their mouth is, because there's too many students that come from disadvantaged backgrounds or low socioeconomic statuses that should not be graduating with catastrophic amount of loans. And that's one thing I take pride in Amherst, that I'm graduating with no loans.
Fantastic.
Thank you for sharing, and that will be an innovative strategy, a category, right? The way you're sharing, and that will be great. Thank you.
Okay, so by way of wrap up. So we've been making a case that compared to what we know, right, compared to what's available to us in the literature about how to successfully diversify a place and then support the students once they come, we, the grown-ups on campus, have tended to be dragged somewhat reluctantly by our students into this fortunate bellwether position that we occupy, and then gloat about, right? And they've been in keeping with the metaphor, put the bell around our neck, bless their hearts. Now, the reason to acknowledge it this way is because when we act like we did that, of our own idea, our own volition and free will, we run the danger of forgetting how hard and uncomfortable the action, it is to make progress, and the progress that we've made so far. And since there's so much work we still need to do, we can't afford to forget that it is inherently difficult and uncomfortable, and that discomfort is in some ways a sign of growth, right? Because if we miss it and remember it as easy, the work ahead will seem harder than it seems to be. We're in this era of sort of these really strangely draconian protest policies to manage the student protests, right out of actually being able to leverage us into doing anything, right? And that's one of the ways, because we've forgotten, we're like, oh, we don't want protests, it's disruptive. We have all these ideas about why, we need to keep things copacetic on campus, but that is one of our greatest sources of power, right? And I've even heard administrators say, hey, guess what? My hands are tied until and unless the students make us think about this, then I get a mandate, I have to do something. So we shouldn't be simultaneously undermining them in that process by forgetting that it's always hard and difficult and uncomfortable to make progress, right? But just as we've always been a little bit more responsive to our students than some other sectors, we can lean in and be a little more responsive, right, in terms of being bellwether. We have so much data these days. We have so much information, and we have the students who are remarkably good at talking about these things in a way that I'm sure students were not 15, 20, 30 years ago. And so we have so much information, and if we lean in and we do a little more, I think we really stand to have a good chance of succeeding at the admittedly harder work of changing the essence of who we are and what we do as institutions, right? And there will still be all the areas for pushback, faculty governance, et cetera, but we can do it if we decide. But it will take a little more than what we've done before, right? To the extent that what we've been doing has been add-ons and around the edges, it will be harder, but it can be done. Excuse me. And it's an excellent time for us to be especially courageous and especially intentional in transforming our campuses into models for excellence around social justice, racial and other diversity concerns, alongside our mission of delivering excellent education You know, like I said, look what we've accomplished being a little more intentional. So if we can be a little more, we may even stand as a buffer against the regressive motions that are happening outside our campuses. And in the end, that's what a bellwether is about, right? Setting the trends for the larger society, which has these same very grave needs.
Thank you.
Thank you.